Welcome to Musitations, sound healing and sound wisdom for a world in need. On Musitations, we explore all things musical, meditative, and creative for healing, transformation, and awakening the relationship between nature, culture, and the soul. I'm Michael Branty Maria, and I'm your host and guide on this journey on the edge of a new millennium. I bring my 30-plus years of experience as an integrative wellness guide, best-selling author, meditation, yoga, mindfulness teacher, and a 4-time Grammy-nominated musician. Join me now on this adventure of awakening the soul. Welcome to another episode of Musitations. It's so great to have you here, and we're in for a real treat. I have been wanting to have Rachel Corbett on my show for a couple years now, ever since I read her amazing book, You Must Change Your Life, the story of Rainer Maria Rilke and Auguste Rodin. It just rocked my world, I just have to tell you. It rocked my world so much, I had to reach out to Rachel, and I wasn't sure I'd hear back, and she so graciously responded. It just took me on such an extraordinary journey. And I also want to mention this book won the 2016 Marfield Prize, which is the National Award for Arts Writing. Now, some of you may not know the Marfield Prize, but it's up there with the Pulitzer Prize. This is an extraordinary, huge, accomplishment, particularly because it's Rachel's first book. Although she's an accomplished writer and journalist, she's written for The New Yorker, The New York Times, The New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, and many other publications. And she also lives in Brooklyn, which I feel a strong connection to since my father immigrated to this country after the Second World War. He lived in Brooklyn for 10 years. And so it has a warm place in my heart. And she's joining us here from Brooklyn, and I'm thrilled to have you here, Rachel. Welcome.
Thank you so much. That's so nice to hear. Way too many compliments. I really
Well, truly, I have such an appreciation for the power of story. And, I did look a little bit, I know you're a very accomplished journalist and do a lot of arts writing and, have been an editor in chief in in the art world. And also I just know, though, that what you brought to this book transcends journalism. You brought a journalist's eye to detail and historical accuracy, but I think one reviewer said on the book that this was a beautifully empathic and intelligent, book about this period of time that's so rich. And I really felt that you brought an artist's eye, a novelist's eye, a filmmaker's eye, bringing this story to life. So again, congratulations on the Marfield Prize and for being here. And I guess it might be a good place to start, because I mentioned to you, and I've mentioned to our listeners, Musitations means all the muses, all the muses in every avenue of creative expression. And so here we have Rodin the sculptor, Rilke the poet, and you the writer. And I'm curious what drew you to this story, maybe to share a little bit of the backstory for those who may not know a bit about what this story is about.
Yeah, so they actually intertwine a little bit because I came into reading Rilke first. I think I was like 18, and my mother gave me a copy of Letters to a Young Poet, which is the book that so many people read first of all his work. He was, in fact, very young, 23 or so, when he was writing it. So it connects to that age very perfectly, at least to people who feel that they have some kind of creative calling, or they're kind of lost, but they know there is something they want to do out there that's different. And so for me, it was perfect because I was just out of high school and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I lived in Iowa. I knew I didn't want to stay there, but I didn't know where to go. And this book was just a total revelation for me. Um, I read it. It's a very small book. I read it all the way through, and then I started it over and read it again. And he doesn't really give any practical advice, but he is inspiring. He makes you feel like you don't need anything. You don't need money. You don't need people around you. You could everything you need to be an artist is already within you. And so for people who are struggling, it's really a major affirmation. So then, later I moved to New York. I became a writer and kind of, put that book aside for many years. And then I worked in the art world. I was editing art magazines, as you mentioned, and writing about art primarily. And I just read somewhere randomly, kind of, that Rodin was living in Paris, and he hired Rilke to work as his secretary. And it kind of blew my mind. It seemed very dissonant. Like these people didn't seem to fit together to me. And I was so surprised that they knew each other. And then I looked into it a bit more. It turns out not only was he his secretary, but they were very, very close. And in fact, a lot of what Rilke was writing in Letters to a Young Poet was wisdom that came from his time with Rodin. And it was, and I saw like maybe that's why it seemed so wise beyond its years a little bit. So as I discovered their relationship, I discovered the book I wanted to write at the same time.
This period of time where we are coming of age and trying to find our way in the world. In particular, I tell people all the time as an artist myself that our culture does not support art and artists for the most part. That it's especially when you have that calling and the need or desire for mentors and what I'd even say, having an artist kind of bless your journey or bless, where you're going. And this struggle between solitude and family and love and your art and what do you give to your family? What do you give? And these two have so many different things. I think, I think you mentioned Rodin was I guess in his 60s, early 60s. Rilke was in his 20s. And he was playing that role for him. And that comes to that period of time when he's looking, how should I live? I think there's that moment where he writes Rodin. And I thought that was so sweet that here he's working for him, but he writes him a letter. Why don't you share what Rodin's reaction was to how should I live? And let's see where that takes us.
So, right, as you mentioned, Rilke wrote this letter, sort of saying, I'm going to come visit you, and I'm so moved by your work, and I can't wait to study under you and see these sculptures in person. But also I want to ask you, how should I live? Because for him, this was actually a question he'd been pursuing for a long time. He always sought mentors. Even before Rodin, he sought Lou Andreas-Salome and George Simmel and others. So it wasn't so much affirmation of his work. He wasn't saying, read my poetry and tell me if it's good or not. It was that he felt that there was some fundamental interplay between the creative process and the creative life, that they were, they had to be merged. You couldn't just work and then go home and live like a normal person and cook dinner. And so, so he asked Rodin this question, and Rodin kind of answered it over time. He kind of revealed his answer over a period of months that they spent together. And Rilke draws the conclusion that for Rodin, the way to live is to work, always work. That's what he would say, like a mantra almost repeatedly, that life should be in service of work. So you're working, and then when you're not working, you live in an environment that is best suited to keep your work. The walls should be painted the right color and the windows so that you can sort of see properly at all times, and the chairs shouldn't have cushions because you should be a little bit uncomfortable all the time. You should always be alert and ready to, never totally outside of the realm of work at some level, never totally relaxed at least. And this, I think, was pretty profound for Rilke. I think he took it to heart, and of course, he'd already lived that way. He already lived in total service to poetry. So it wasn't a big lifestyle change, I don't think, but it did kind of justify and give him courage to continue moving forward. And also on a less positive note, it kind of allowed him to, negate his duties as a father and a husband.
Yeah, no, I love that. And that was definitely, that would have been my father's mantra too, I'm not sure I would pronounce the French right. What travailler toujours, travailler,
Yeah.
so that work, always work, that sense of this strong work ethic. And I think there's that moment when you mention, although yes, Rilke always had a strong work ethic, it gave him, I guess, the action, to be more action oriented, being so much more of a dreamer and living on that inner plane, and that gave him. Well, here I think actually I think I have a quote of yours here. That it seemed to contradict this mantra of work always work, contradicted everything Rilke had learned about the fusion of life and art. But the poet had spent years watching the clouds, anxiously awaiting a muse that never came. Rodin's example gave him permission to act. Now to work was to live without waiting. That gets me emotional.
I think he was always very interested in the idea of a muse, and the idea that he needed to receive something from somewhere else or someone else, that he didn't, for some reason, he didn't have it on his own. I think that's why he sought out all of these other people. It's why I think he describes all of his great works being sort of divine to him by an angel, or just walking and having it strike him. He never talks about sitting there and working hard, but of course he did. That's what I think, that whether he ever really talked about it, he didn't a lot, but I think Rodin did propel him to sit and work and to start small, describing simple things and then bigger things, and then moving into the realm of love and death and emotions. And but it took, there's a big gap between the idea of what you can do and actually achieving it. And I think for so many people, like you said, it's they just feel paralyzed by the idea and never get it done. But even though I think Rilke did embrace the sort of labor of poetry, even until his death, he described it as if it was just given to him and he was just a vessel, which is kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, no, that's so beautiful. And I that sense of having someone both blessing his journey and also, the thing poems, to start small, and to deepen out of that, is, I think, was just revolutionary for him and helped him craft or deepen his art of seeing. And it makes me, that to me is a beautiful moment where, I think that I think even Lou called it his turning. And when he said, after doing all the thing poems, after kind of focusing on the animals and the things, almost sculpting with words in his poetry, the way he saw Rodin dream with his hands. That's another phrase. I love that, dreaming with his hands. That he says, the work of the eyes is done. Now go and do heart work. And you bring such empathy to the people you write about. And you bring up that too as being kind of a new word that was being coined at this turning of the century, turning of the ages, and the power, importance, and how empathy played a part for them and for you in writing the book.
Yeah, it's so interesting because at the time I was writing it, empathy was this kind of buzzword in culture. I don't know. It was. I mean, it's ridiculous to say in a way, but someone was like, someone once told me, empathy is the new black. It's really popular, and there are all these books about empathy. It was a period when people were going more online and feeling like we were losing connections to others, and I think there was this desire to kind of reclaim our connections to people. Um, that's kind of just a coincidence. It's not why I wrote this book, but it's something I've always been very interested in. And so when I found that empathy is actually a term that originated in art history or in aesthetic philosophy, um, and that it coincided almost exactly with this sort of with Rodin and Rilke's evolutions. It wasn't just an idea that was kind of buried in some philosophy building. It was really a current in the art scene at that time, in literature and visual art, everything. So and Rilke studied at in Munich University there, and this was where some of the main professors researching this early iteration of empathy, which is very different from what we know it to be today. Um, he would have taken classes with some of these people, so he probably was right on the cusp of it. And interestingly, well, I'll tell you first what it was then, which was um, it was called Einfühlung, which is German for literally it's in feeling.
Yes, yes.
Um, it was not exactly like empathy today. It was used to describe how we feel physically stirred or emotional from seeing a work of art, like when a dancer leaps on stage and you kind of get this rush for her, and then or why a painting makes you want to cry. And it was trying to figure out that interplay between a work of art and a personal human emotion. And then over time, Freud and psychiatrists started to think, well, if this connects a person to an object, maybe this is also what connects people to other people. And so empathy became a term of psychology and interpersonal relationships. And also, I think at that time, interestingly, I don't know that Rilke was aware of all these kind of evolutions in psychology, but when he came around to doing, say, that Heartwork poem, that is about when it became an emotion between people. When in psychology, empathy became much more commonly understood as the thing we know it today to be. And so when he's talking about Heartwork, he's talking about his own kind of how he had sort of been bereft his whole life of connections with certain loved ones, with women. He had relationships, but they never lasted. And his own daughter, he had kind of abandoned. And I think he was getting older and starting to think more and more about real human connections, love, heartwork, how we want to call it.
That's beautiful. And I try to remember the phrase you used, but that here he had been doing work, always work, and he had been working himself to death. And there's the moment he kind of looks back and realizes, well, Rodin, yeah, sure he worked, but he was, yeah, he was stoic, but he was also an epicure. He was also a sensualist. He didn't deny himself much, and in that you mentioned, and again, I'm paraphrasing, but that he had denied himself some of the most sacred joys of living a life. And I guess, this is the perennial question, to what we sacrifice for our work, or what we sacrifice in human relationships, and giving birth to this larger gift, and how our personal relationships may suffer from that. I've always been one to try to seek balance in both art and relationships, and see that, how they kind of intertwine, and if the art isn't also feeding this other ecosystem of relationships, the dangers that can come into that, which is, and I shared with you before we started, was, I did this paper on Rilke and Rodin at a Creativity and Madness conference. And, you bring up times where, well, Camille Claudel ends up, also as a very passionate, gifted artist who struggles with madness when she isn't able to become a legitimate partner to Rodin. And then, Rilke is at times struggling with madness. And I love even when Lou, his mentor and informal therapist, his life, becomes a psychoanalyst, through Freud. And there's that moment that you paint so beautifully in the book where she actually, he's just not happy and he's going a little mad. And she's like, well, maybe you should go, right. Maybe you should go have some psychoanalysis. And then she says, no. Perhaps you need a little madness to push you through to the rest of the elegies. So I'm not even sure if I'm asking a question, but I would love for you to respond to your own thoughts about this, both in terms of everyone you wrote about in this particular journey, but because you're immersed in this world of art and artists, and I'm sure you see the good, the bad, the ugly, all of that.
I think it's so interesting. At that time, there was the feeling that psychoanalysis would cure you of the demons, but would also take away your creativity, which I guess the demons had some role
Right.
in producing. And it seems very, very antiquated to me now, of course.
Sure.
I think also at the time, psychoanalysis was very different too. It was really more of a creative, there was not really proper training. There was, but it was all over.
They weren't sure what they were doing.
So I don't know. On the other hand, I think it could have been really interesting for Rilke to just explore his mind.
Yes.
He really agonized about whether to do it. He spent some day. He wrote letters to Lou and thought about it, and then backed out, and then thought, But I think he agreed. Yeah, that ultimately you need a little madness.
It reminds me, and partly because, I'm also retired from 30 years plus working as a Jungian-oriented psychologist. And so that whole world of how, and I think, this would take us far afield, but I'm actually in complete agreement with you that I feel in fact, we just had a performance of the play Red, which is, the play about Rothko. And, it just, and the famous pieces he was going to have at the Four Seasons restaurant. And it paints, unfortunately, kind of this, he was a terrible alcoholic, and I think that maybe that's part of that, even that, and although we might think of it as kind of a romantic idea of, this creativity and madness, I do think what happens so often is this inflation of the ego, or this sense of, that one has to be a little mad to create something new. And I do think that's antiquated, and I do think that's not accurate. But I also feel like, particularly in our particular culture, in fact, sometimes I feel like I would like to rename this podcast Love, Death, and Madness. It would probably get a lot more listeners, actually. So I'm seriously thinking of it, actually, because I think in our culture, it's a conversation with death, conversation with madness as simply the parts of us. The way I talk about it in my work is that the ego is a child of society and the soul is a child of nature. So from that standpoint, the soul, and when I say soul, I'm not meaning any religious context, but that deep essential essence of who we are before we become languaged beings, because then we become part and parcel and domesticated within a particular time, historical epoch, and all of those things which become filters on what truly is possible. And so for me, so much of what I try to do when I'm helping people embrace their creativity is unlearn, what they've been taught, or be able to get to this place of more. I actually read your piece on, is it Joan, the performance artist?
Oh,
Joan Jonas?
Joan Jonas.
Joan Jonas. And so I love this place of improvisation for that reason, and to try to, always be, keep those things that are fresh. And from that standpoint, I think actually she was talking about needing to stay healthy for a performance and being in good condition. And so I really have that sense in which what we think of as madness, which some people, this is actually both the title of this book, Witness to the Fire, and Jung's basic message. When you're going to create something or bring something new into the world, it does erode all of your certainties, and that can make you feel mad. And addiction, all addictions, whether that's alcohol, drugs, or work, I mean, work can be an addiction, is actually addressing the right problem in the wrong way, meaning that we're all seeking transcendence of this burdensome ego consciousness, where we're living in this filtered reality that feels pretty boring. But when we find ways, which is what partly for me what art does, is it lifts those filters off so we can see more the sheer mystery of just being, that artists and poets. And whenever we're also, I think we all have opportunities to this when we're kind of just about to drift off to sleep, or just about waking up, or in our dream world, or when we are inspired, or when we're in love, or maybe when we're a little half mad, or maybe when we're dealing with the death of a loved one. It shears that stuff away. And I have a feeling that's part of what, when artists like Rilke and Rodin, because they love living on the edge.
Well, you said so many things that resonate, and put them much better than I could have. But the one thing that struck me is when you're talking about, madness could be mental illness or addiction, but
Sure.
it could also be, in a broader term, just a different way of seeing the world.
Yes. Yes.
The world the way most people do, you could call that madness. In various periods, we have called that madness. So I think that's probably what artists want to protect is their way of seeing the world, and what Rilke was when he was protecting himself from psychoanalysis. But also, you said something about stripping away the all of the layers of society that are that have been crusted upon us.
Yes.
And I think that was one of the major projects of this period that Rilke spent with Rodin, because Rodin would always tell him that, to say before you look at a woman, let's say a figure of a woman, you have to start with like this tiny little shell or a tiny little leaf, and learn to see that so fully, like go into the leaf until you feel the leaf growing within you. And then, write where it needs to be a leaf, or draw it. And then you can move on to a snail, maybe, or on to the next thing, and that everything is just a building apart. But when you look fresh, when you look at a leaf, like with pure eyes and pure in wonderment, you will really learn to see. I think that's what they were kind of trying to do, was go back to that original awe-like vision of a child.
Yes. That's, I think of William Blake, and the music education that changed my life was with the cellist David Darling, who was an extraordinary classical jazz and, for lack of a better word, he didn't like the phrase New Age, musician. And I did this 4-year apprenticeship with him called Music for People, which was actually learning to, the whole message of that apprenticeship was return to child, and begin to play again the way you did as a child, and I remember, actually you described, I don't know if you were saying it or Rilke was describing Rodin with amongst his sculptures and his work as a child amongst his toys.
Yeah.
And that's how I am when I have my, when I'm around I call them my babies, actually, my instruments. And it's very similar to that delight of a child. And yeah, just seeing, as Blake would say, as things as they truly are, as infinite. and that there is, everything's a fractal of that infinite process, that whatever it is that we're swimming in, this mystery. So that's, and you really brought that, to the table with that. I, and I do have to ask, unless you want to respond to anything else, how has, writing this book changed you? You must change your life. And I'm just curious if you have any response to that.
I felt that I was going along this, I felt that I was discovering everything that Rilke was discovering through his eyes. I feel like in a way I was on the same journey because um, I didn't know anything about this relationship. And I really wanted to trace how he became from one person to another. I wanted to really try to figure out as many points of turning as I could and as many revelations, because I always want to chart how someone becomes the way they are. And, so for me, I was sort of taking these lessons along with him. And although I didn't go to the zoo and sketch gazelles and panthers in the same way he did, I was imagining, I was putting myself there, trying to write it, to make the scene. And I felt in a way that I was living through it a little bit. And it's so rare that you can see an artist's process really as closely as you could with Rilke, because he documented everything. He wrote thousands of letters and in journals, and he was one of these writers who thought through writing. You got the sense his letters mirror poems that were published later. Like every letter he was working out an idea for a poem. So I felt like I really had this inner look, and that I could also, I think it helped me look a little bit slower too, and appreciate work in a different way. And I always liked Rodin. The work is just so impactful when you see it, I think, for anybody, most people. But I didn't think about it that much. I didn't have the kind of appreciation that I now have. Now I love it. And every time you go see his work, you're in the museum where he made it, the home that they made together, and you really feel like you're in his milieu, in his space, and how it was meant to be. And that has so much more meaning, knowing that he was carefully curating his space in every way. It had to do with the work as well. So anyway, I guess I just feel like I went on this journey, and although I was less concerned with how to live my life at this point, I think it was mostly just revelation after revelation. I mean, just the empathy. I just live for this stuff. The making a connection between art and psychology. That's a nexus I always love, and that it's to find it so literally connected in this way. I think it was more just a process. I never quite felt so happy to go to the library every day and immerse myself in this world. It was really a pleasure, and writing is often not at all a pleasure. It's often so.
Oh, that's beautiful, and it comes across. I mean, I always, even when I'm trying to decide on my next project, it's, if I'm following my interest, my experiences, if I'm having a good time, then the people who are experiencing my art or writing are having a good time. And that passion and joy came through. I mean, I think that I was like, and so are there any plans for a screenplay?
I know, I would love to have a screenplay. I mean, this book was also a first for me in terms of, I write journalism, as you mentioned, so I write factually in nonfiction, but I've never written history like this before. And now now I'm much more interested in writing maybe another book of history. But the screenplay, I would love, if you're interested. Anyway, no.
No, I am interested. There's few stories that I have found as compelling And because it's also, you have this incredible period of time too, which to me is actually, as we're coming into this strange period of the end of another century and the other, we have no idea where we're going, but I'm very interested in these turning points, and you paint that so powerfully. But part of my fascination is too because it informs us kind of with where we're going. I saw there's something about both of them that touch something I think more archetypal and essential in, this would take us far, far afield, but where I see the necessity of creativity and art going, if we are going to survive as a species. It's like, the crisis in not just culture, but nature, and the relationship between culture and nature. And there's something about both of these men, their story, and also those who they were surrounded by, who were weaving, to me, for lack of a better word, I think of as this mysterious intertwining of nature and culture, which to me is most beautifully expressed in creativity. And so there's something, I don't know, the book actually gave me hope too, in a weird sort of way, about, like, even it's made me question the deepest part of my own work. Like, what am I trying to say? I mean, I probably get choked up here, but I think one of the themes throughout was the value of truth over beauty, even, but a truth that doesn't abandon beauty, but this, what I think of as deeper beauty, the beauty of, again, for lack of a better word, the soul. And I don't know, they both were lovers. I mean, you have to give that to me. Yeah. So they really screwed up some relationships, but you can't deny that both of these men loved the women that inspired them, and were, I think, is tragically struggling with the relationship between, and maybe this is, an interesting place to land here. And again, I'm paraphrasing, but this is like one of my mantras from Rilke, from the letters, to bring that circle around. True lovers are the keepers of each other's solitude, and this support of allowing each of us to become the world that we are, and not merge, but also not abandon. And how do we, and I think that has everything to do with also how we live with nature and animals and trees, and so I can wax pretty poetic about, like, the larger picture that their stories, and you're bringing that story to me. I mean, I'm sitting with this question of you must change your life quite personally ever since I've read the book. It's always there for me, but particularly since I retired my psych practice and 100% focused on my art and writing right now, and so I want to thank you again for that, and just any thoughts about any of that, if any of that touches a chord for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the nature aspect is really interesting, and I think you identified something very important in all of this. And I think what's interesting is that you say, truth, especially Rodin would talk about this. Truth is more important than beauty. You don't go after the most beautiful woman to sculpt. It might be the ugly janitor that you sculpt.
Yes.
But it's real. And I think truth to him was kind of nature. Nature was baseline. Nature was what was first, and therefore it was always going to be the most beautiful. Artists were only, students to nature. We were always just trying to emulate the beauty of nature. And so if it's the leaf, or it's the way the janitor's face looks and its broken nose and whatever else, that was natural. And artists were always adding, flourishes and trying to beautify things. And so for Rodin, he was steadfast that nature was art of the highest order, and we as humans could only try to achieve, anything like that, and that was truth at the same time. So I think that's important. It's something I can think about more, and also just that the women that you mentioned, it's not to say Rilke had, complicated relationships. I think he broke some hearts along the way in his life, but he chose women who were extremely intelligent and inspiring, and that he obviously valued for their minds, and they were often collaborators. So more so than Rodin did, but I think that he was always seeking that collaboration. For as much as he thought he needed to lock himself up in like a cave or a castle on the Adriatic or whatever, he really did value closeness to a point, closeness with solitude.
Yes, that's beautiful, and I don't know if I'm wanting to think it's probably more Buber or Kierkegaard, but the deeper your solitude, the deeper your communion and togetherness. And I love that. And I think that Rilke would agree with that. And it seems like such a paradox, but it's so true. I mean, it's so true. And yeah, I describe myself as an outgoing introvert. I'm such an introvert, but when I'm with other introverts talking about what's important to me, I can, well, as you see already, I can be a chatterbox when it's something that really matters to me, which Jung said. He said, loneliness is not being alone. It's not being able to share and talk about what's important to you, which is really beautiful.
And I love what Rilke said about loneliness, which is that it's just space expanding around you.
Yes. No, I actually have that quote here. I was, that think of it as vastness.
Yeah.
And
you
I
can just expand that much more.
Yeah. No, it's really, really beautiful. Well, we could talk, I think, for a few more hours, but I know we both have some things coming up. But I wanted to give you a chance before we finish. I think that was a beautiful place to land. Just to let people know, if they're interested in finding out more about your writing, finding out about the book, and I want to tell everyone who's listening out there to buy this book and read it. It's for anybody who is looking for how to live more deeply, more fully, and I couldn't recommend it more enough. It's one of my favorite reads. I think it's in my top 5 books now. I mean, and I read thousands and thousands. I adore this book. So I hope everyone out there gets a chance to experience it. But in terms of where it's available, and also if people wanted to find out more about some of your writing, I have a lot of artists and musicians that tune in. Creatives are kind of my demographic. So
yeah. Well, thank you so much. I mean, that's just, I'm over the moon. You've made me feel so good with all this praise, and I'm really grateful that you found something in it, and I hope other people do too. My publisher is Norton, and you can get it anywhere online. I have a website too. It's rachel-corbett.com. So that's just kind of an archive for everything I've done, which is a lot of art, but also completely different things: healthcare, politics, crime, every now and then. So, something for everyone, I hope. But yeah, and I don't know what else to say.
Is there a new book in the works?
There
Even
is.
What's going on there?
I'm doggedly trying to finish it now. It's due in like 2 weeks here.
Oh, bless your heart. Wow. Well,
very different. It's very different. It's a kind of history of crime, certain facets of crime, and how what scares a society, what criminals look like in a given society says about the society itself. Criminals change, but the fears and we're afraid of kind of stayed the same. But
No, that's it. And especially, I mean, I did a lot of, forensic psychology early on in my career, and
good.
oh my gosh, interviewing in high security prisons, and it was in testified in over 100 cases. So
I didn't know that.
yeah. So maybe that's another conversation for us
I
to have.
know. Sounds like
But that boundary between, again, society and what the margins of society, you know, yeah, like I'm a big Michel Foucault fan, who was both in terms of the prison and the history of madness and the history of the quote criminal or crime and prisoner and power structures and all of that. It's really important work. It really is. But I just want to thank you, Rachel, for being here. I'm so thrilled that you were open to doing this, and I'm so grateful you wrote this book. And I'm sure we'll have more creative conversations, and we might have to have you back on another time to talk about the muse of crime. Who knows? But thank you so much for being here. And we all wish you the very best with this new book as well. Does it have a title yet?
no. I kind of do those at the end.
Yeah, no, I know. It's so true. Same thing. Whenever I try to title an album, it always changes by the end. So
Really?
it's just a working title. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Except with this book, I have to say that Rilke line, "You must change
You
your
must
life,"
change your life.
that was so striking to me. I knew it had to be the title. But
Yeah, it literally leaped off the page when I saw. I was like, I have to get this. I was so thrilled. I was like, really? Somebody's written a book about this? It was such a treat. So, well, we wish you well in everything, and thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Musitations. You've been listening to Musitations, sound healing and sound wisdom for a world in need, where we explore all things musical, meditative, and creative for healing, transformation, and awakening the soul. I've been your guide and host, Michael Brandt DeMaria. Feel free to check out my music on Pandora, Amazon Music, Spotify, XM Sirius Radio, or Soundscapes Cable. You can also check out my website at michaeldemaria.com or online programs at alldaypeace.com, alldaypeace.com. Listen to your heart, follow your soul, and we'll see you on the next episode of Musitations.